This story happened in July. My husband and I decided to take our 2 kids camping one weekend, since we couldn't really do much else due to the coronavirus. Plus, we loved camping anyway, and had never taken the kids with us before. Our daughter is 2, and our son is 6 years old. We went out to our usual place, where the campsites were about half a mile away from each other. Well, of course, once it started to get dark, our kids started getting quite scared. They wanted to leave, so we decided to take them to my dad's for the weekend. We went back to the campsite on our own around midnight or so. We decided it was now time to go to bed. We laid down and fell asleep rather quickly. Around an hour or 2 later, I woke up and had to pee. I woke my husband up as well. He got up and walked with me to the bathroom, which was about halfway between the campsites. On our way back, though, we saw a light coming from our campsite. This kind of worried us, making us think maybe somebody was looking for us. We quickly walked back to the campsite, but right before we got out of the tree line, my husband threw his arm out to stop me. "Hey, what are you—" "Shh." I stayed quiet and looked back at the campsite. I watched the light, and that's when I saw a glint of silver in the person's hand. They were holding a long knife. We ducked down and hid behind some trees, and in typical scary movie fashion, the guy apparently heard us crouching down. He moved and shined his light towards the woods where we were. He started running, and we took off running in the opposite direction. We could hear him sprinting through the brush behind us. We kept checking behind to look, but now the light was gone. Eventually, we were able to circle back down to the road and crept slowly back to my husband's SUV. We both hopped in and drove away as fast as we could. We called the police as well. They had us take them back to the campsite, and we waited in the car while they checked everything out, the campsite and the surrounding area. Soon, we saw even more police cars pull up. The original 2 officers came up to us and asked us to walk over to the tent with them. We did so, and what we saw there was shocking. Our tent had been slashed apart to pieces, and so had all of our other stuff as well, quite meticulously. The police ended up evacuating all the other campers in the area. They did a sweep of the entire place, but they didn't find anything, except the flashlight, which had apparently been dropped along the way we ran. We follow up with the police every month since then, but there have been no new updates. I'll post more if anything ever comes up, but I'm not sure it will. My husband and I have always loved to go camping. We live in California and set aside 2 weeks every summer for a camping trip where we can just get away together and disconnect from the real world. Normally, we hit up Death Valley for some backcountry adventures for a few days, then head up into the mountains for some quality fishing. On the way home, we usually stop for one last hurrah in the Eastern Sierra. On this particular trip, my husband, myself, and our German Shepherd Ginger were all there together. We ended up finding a lake to swim in for the day, and when we got tired of that, we decided to find a spot to camp. We were both fairly familiar with that area and knew there was a free campground about 12 miles up the mountain. I never really liked that specific campground. It can get pretty cold at night because of the elevation, even in the summer. But whatever. It was free, right? And we had plenty of firewood with us. When we first pulled into the campground, there was only one tent pitched, but we couldn't see any people around at all. In fact, for the entire evening, there was not a single other person in sight. I kinda love it when the campground is so empty, and this was a pretty primitive and remote area. It was quite rare to even see people driving past. After we got all set up and the beer was flowing very freely, we got pretty trashed and hung out for a bit. We cooked a good dinner over the campfire and decided to hit the sack. My husband, dog, and I were all sound asleep when we were suddenly awoken by this ungodly scream in the middle of the night. One of us grabbed the phone to see what time it was. Then my husband grabbed his gun and told me to stay there while he went out to see what was happening. Of course, I couldn't help but want to peek out as well. I could see there in the light of the moon, a guy was standing in front of the other tent that was set up across the screen, just staring into the sky and screaming. It was this loud, horrific, blood-curdling scream that was completely terrifying. Normally, seeing something like that might prompt a call to the police, but due to being so remote, the cell signal was non-existent. My husband didn't want to go over to confront the man for obvious reasons, so instead he came back to the tent with me, and we stayed up for the rest of the night searching out while the man screamed. The next morning, we packed up and left as soon as we could. That same tent was still there, but once again there was now nobody in sight. We actually drove past there many days later, out of curiosity. That same tent was still pitched in the same spot, but there were still no other campers around. This was about 10 years ago. We visit the area frequently still, since we now have a cabin about 20 miles from that campground. Whenever we take a drive up into the mountains and pass it by, that scream is always the first thing we talk about. I always wonder what was going on with that guy, and why was he just screaming and freaking out like that in the middle of nowhere? So this story takes place in southeast Texas, within 100 miles of Houston. I was in college at the time, but I moved back in with my parents for a semester after some big roommate drama. My parents live out in the country miles outside of town with some acreage as well. The land in the back of the house consists of 4 zones really. You got your backyard with the nice St. Augustine, the back, which is a section of woods my parents cleared of underbrush and kept fairly maintained. The back, which was a clearing we used to go back and do bonfires and parties in high school, and then the woods. After high school, my parents kind of gave up on keeping back the brush and weeds from anything except their nice backyard section. Imagine a big backyard fenced in by a wall of huge weeds and tall trees that goes far, far back. Then a field of even bigger weeds transitioning into solid, dense woods with oak, some pine, briar, and all that sort of stuff. I also had this dog my parents let me keep outside at the time. They had a big chain-link dog run she lived in since my parents had no perimeter fencing besides some barbed wire at the very, very back of the property. This dog was not the type to stay in one spot. In fact, she was very aggressive to other dogs, always going after them acting tough. I sometimes worried she'd get out and kill the neighbor's chickens one day. She was about 60 pounds and not a jumpy or scared dog at all. Since I was in college, I had no curfew or anything like that. I would always come home late at night or very early in the morning after hanging out with friends all night or studying or what have you. On this particular night, it was pretty cold out. 50 degrees is cold, and you can't tell me any different. Even though the dog had a house and bed and straw out there, I felt really bad for her staying out in such a cold environment, so instead I decided to bring her inside to sleep with me. I should have been more careful because this happened quite a bit, but somehow this dog always got me. She would wait in the back until the gate was unlocked and I was in the run, gate closed with an unlocked horseshoe latch. Then she'd sprint around me and pop the gate latch with her nose, then bolt off into the woods. Of course, in this exact moment, she did this same thing, and my dumbass was left standing there in the run in the cold in the middle of the night. I was extremely pissed because I knew I now had to go find her and bring her back. The moon was pretty bright out, and I had seen her fly into that big weed wall and disappear completely. I followed her in without any light, calling out her name. There were some little trails through the weeds we tried to at least keep open so we could access the property, but these were less wide than a person can walk, and the weeds were about a head taller than me. It was quite dense. Anyway, I'd gone quite a ways in and had passed through the wooded section out into the clearing area. Solid weeds all around, 5 to 8 feet tall. I got real quiet, listening and trying to hear the sounds of where she might be out there, when I could hear intermittent rustling out toward the woods. At this point, they were just really a tall, dark outline at the edge of this weed jungle. The rustling wasn't the sound I expected, though. Usually she was crashing about through the woods. In my head, I was thinking, what the hell is she doing now? In all honesty, I thought she was probably rolling around in some dead skunk or something, and I was going to have to bathe her heavily. Figuring it was my wild-ass dog, I started to make my way toward the noise, calling out her name once again. As I got closer, though, it became quite apparent that this rustling was not the sound of an animal charging through underbrush, but more like something intentionally shaking the trees. Like how if you would grab a branch and shake it, and all the connected trees and vines would shake as well. I was close enough now to make out individual branches silhouetted at the top of the tree line. I could see that whatever was going on, it was causing the trees to shake all the way to the very top of the canopy. This was weird. This was decidedly not my dog just prancing around. I shut up immediately and froze. You hear a lot in these kinds of stories, people talking about how when they notice the woods just go silent. I can't remember if this happened or not, but as I stood there, I could clearly hear 2 or 3 loud, deep huffs. I guess it kind of sounded like a bull, but with an even deeper fluttering to it. Not like the tonal sounds a cow might make, but the deep, heavy exhale an animal makes when they're defensive. The sound seemed to come from around my head height. For some reason, my mind registered this thing was a lot closer to me than the tree line now. I also remember the distinct feeling that this noise was now directed at me. I immediately got this terrible feeling in my gut, whole body fear. I panicked. Rational or not, I called out my dog's name with all fear and urgency. You know how your voice gets higher and louder at the end. I turned and sprinted away as hard as I could. Either my dog heard my tone and got scared, or she had also been scared of whatever was on that tree line too, because as I crashed through those weeds, she came up on my left from a creek and flew past me like a bullet. When I got to the open garage, she was desperately trying to get in the back door to the house, jumping at it like a crazed animal. I closed it up and put her in the kennel and went to bed. I don't know what it was exactly. At the time, I convinced myself it was one of those hogzillas you hear about in the news. I've been around plenty of cattle and never heard one make a noise quite like this. I know it probably really was just a big boar or something, but something just didn't quite feel right that night. This was like 10 years ago now, but I know for sure I'm still gonna think real hard about it if I ever have to go back out there alone at night again. I was told you guys might like this here. This happened when I was still growing up, around 2004 or 2005. I was about 13 years old back then, I think. It took place in a rural area, a good ways outside the town of Uvalde, Texas. The town itself was really small back then, not exactly much to look at, just one of those towns that really wasn't on the way to anywhere important. My father knew someone who owned a deer lease that was about 1,000 acres, I think. It was just down outside of that area, and they were complaining a lot about a ton of hogs that were tearing up their land at the time. Being open season on hogs in the south, my dad thought he would surprise me that summer and take me down for a week to go hunting for them. Not only did that help him with networking for his job, but it also gave us a good opportunity for some quality father-son time. I remember the drive down there from Dallas was torture. It was about 7 hours in total in my dad's hard-top Jeep Wrangler. That car was so uncomfy. I hated it. All I really had to do on the drive was either stare out the window or try and beat Super Mario Land 2 on my Game Boy Pocket, something I was never able to accomplish throughout my youth. The drive obviously took almost the entire day, so we got there in the early evening. The owner of the land had told my dad that he hadn't had anyone lease it that year yet. The cabin in the property might be a little rough and dusty because of this. I didn't really care though. At this point in my life, I had been in the Scouts for a couple of years now, and spent a lot of my free time in the woods or fishing with friends. Needless to say, I was more than comfortable roughing it. So after unlocking the gate and driving down to the cabin on the land, we settled in. The cabin was pretty rough. Dust and dirt everywhere, bunches of flies. I remember it looked like some raccoons had gotten into the cabin as well and crapped all over the place. After cleaning up a bit and getting the sleeping bags out, then setting up the cots, we decided to take a rest for the day. Something about that night was weird though. For some reason, I was never able to get a comfortable enough state to fall asleep for any restful amount. I couldn't quite put my finger on why, but I remember having a distinct feeling of now being watched. I was finally able to drift off for what I guessed was maybe an hour at most. We woke up quite early, around 7 a.m. or so. We decided to scout around the land for tracks and signs of hogs, and find a good place to set up a blind. It was summertime and extremely hot in the afternoon, so morning was the best time to be out and about. After walking for an hour or so, we came to this area of trees which was lightly dense, and luckily found some signs of hogs there. Typically torn up ground where they had been rooting, so we followed them out into the trees. I was looking for even more signs when suddenly my dad stopped me with his arm. I remember looking up and just seeing someone standing about 50 yards away, their body hiding behind trees. This was private land. This person was not supposed to be here. We also had confirmation from the owner before we came that nobody was here either, not to mention the gate had been completely locked up when we first arrived. The person was wearing some brightly colored red jacket. We slowly walked toward them. My dad called out to them, something like, "Hey, we're hunters. This is private land you're on." The person didn't move at all though, dead still. We were about 30 yards away now. I could see that he was turned away from us, with his hands deep in his pockets. I started to notice something even weirder. This person was in what looked like a ski jacket and what looked to be ski pants as well. Now, this was Texas in the summer, about 100 degrees outside by then. My dad called out again. No reaction. He signaled for me to stay behind him and unsnapped the clip to his pistol holster. At the time, that's all we had since we were only scouting the area. The rifles had been left back at the cabin. We approached the person's right side slowly, and my dad told me to stay put about 20 yards away. I stayed and crouched down and watched him circle around to the front of the man, all while talking to him and asking if something was wrong. He finally passed around to the front of the man. My dad stood bolt upright with a confused look over his face. I called out to him and asked what was wrong. "It's a mannequin." I walked over to it while my dad stood there staring. As I got closer, one thing stood out the most. The clothes this mannequin was wearing were brand new. No dust, no sap, no bird droppings, no signs of being outside for more than a day at most. I looked over at my dad. I could see him getting quite worried. Almost immediately, I felt that feeling again. We were being watched, and I could tell my dad felt it too. I wanted to start crying. I remember feeling suddenly so scared and vulnerable. My dad whispered to me, "We're leaving, right now." He grabbed my hand and drew his pistol. He scanned the area the whole way back while I was trying my best to hold back panicked tears. We got back as fast as we could. I was so terrified it felt like an eternity, but in reality it was about 45 minutes. After returning, we packed up and beat feet right away. We drove back home that day and didn't talk very much on the way back. I remember right after we left, my dad called up his buddy, the owner of the land, and he was so confused. He told us he would go check it out next week when he was in the area. He also said he'd never had an issue with people there before because his property was high fenced. My dad normally isn't a paranoid person, but me being young and the least possibly having someone there we didn't know anything about, he decided to be cautious and just get out of there. Not worth being killed by a psycho in the woods or something. After we got home, we talked about it a bit. My dad wasn't able to sleep the night before either. He'd had the same feeling of someone watching us, but he didn't want to wake me up because he thought I was in a deep sleep. Turns out that next week we got a call from his buddy. He checked the whole property, never found a single trace of anyone. No mannequin either. That story still makes my hair stand on end. No idea what that was, but the paranoid man in me thinks it was some kind of trap or something. It's maybe not the creepiest thing that's happened to me in the woods, but it's definitely top 3. Whoever was out there, I have no idea what you wanted, but I'm glad we didn't get the chance to meet. Hi y'all. This happened to me about 11 years ago, when walking home from a friend's house late at night. I'll just get straight into the story. I used to live in a rural part of the UK, and I've lived in rural areas most of my life. I was used to having long walks, occasionally at night, especially before I could drive. They never really bothered me too much. I'd get creeped out occasionally because of the atmosphere or whatever, but this one night was the most terrifying experience I ever had. There was this one friend who used to live roughly 3 miles away from my house or so. He had really cool parents, and my other friends and I would often go over to his house and play video games with him and hang out. Occasionally, this meant walking home at night if I happened to stay late. There were 2 ways back from his house. The roadway, which was about 5 miles long, and took about 30 to 45 minutes. The roads were quiet and eerie sometimes, but they were lit up by street lamps, so it never really bothered me walking this way. The other way, though, was a shortcut through these woods. It took off about 2 miles from the trip. The wooded bit was about a mile or so long. I often favored this wooded shortcut, and had probably walked it over 100 times at this point. The woods were dark, however. Combined with the lack of ambient light due to living in a rural area, you had almost absolute abyssal darkness. Luckily, at least most of the time, I had my phone light to walk with. Sometimes, though, my phone would just die, or the battery would be so low the flash wouldn't work, and I'd have to use my screen light instead. As you probably guessed by now, this was one such occasion. I remember my friends and I had just finished up watching a film. It was about 10 p.m., so we all started to leave my friend's house and head our separate ways home. I contemplated briefly on which way I should go when I decided to take the shortcut through the woods. I started walking away from his house and towards the path that headed off into that forest. The streetlights dimmed as I entered the field before it. I glanced at my phone and saw my battery was really low, only enough power left for a couple of minutes of flash. Then I'd have to use my screen for light. That wouldn't last the entire way either. As I saw the tree line approaching, I switched on the flash and followed the well-trodden path out into the dark. To my dismay, though, my light died within seconds of entering. I flipped my phone over to try and at least shine the way using the screen. As I walked, I looked out for all of the familiar landmarks I was used to seeing to ensure I was heading in the right direction. A funky tree stump here, check. Half-fallen fir tree, check. Enormous puddle I had to jump over, check. All was going well so far. About halfway through, though, my phone completely died altogether. I remember the exact moment this happened. It was like I had suddenly been engulfed in darkness. I'm not sure if you've ever experienced this level yourself, but it was so dark I couldn't even see my own hand, only an inch in front of my face. Naturally, my pace slowed down considerably, and I started having to hold my hands out in front of me to make sure I wasn't going to walk into a tree or something. I continued to walk for another minute or so, until all of a sudden, a pungent smell wafted over me. Cigarette smoke. I glanced around, but of course I couldn't see anything. Then I heard it though, a single cough. I wasn't alone. Thoughts raced through my head. Who would be out in the woods this dark? Were they following me? Had I gotten lost or something? I started to quicken my pace, throwing a little bit of caution to the wind. I carried on walking and tripped slightly on a branch. As I regained my balance, I could hear another sound. Branches breaking underfoot, what sounded like immediately behind me. The snapping turned into fast footsteps and grew louder and louder. I began to sprint into that darkness. I felt the well-trodden path turn into brush, I felt branches and logs and plants now hitting my legs. Needless to say, it was not long before I fell down hard. I was lying on the floor in the dark, holding my knee in pain. I could hear branches snapping around me and a voice muttering something incomprehensibly. I didn't dare to move. All of a sudden, a torch turned on in the darkness. I couldn't see anything except this single beam of light, which seemed to be eaten quickly by the rest of the darkness in the forest. I laid there motionless on the ground as the beam started to sweep throughout the trees. I could still hear this person mumbling and now growling. The crunching of footfalls grew closer and closer. They were only a few feet from me by this point. I couldn't even breathe. The light went out. The snapping of branches grew, and then nothing. Complete silence. My eyes were wide open, but I couldn't see a single thing. Then, though, I heard wheezing right above me. The man was standing over me. I wanted to cry. I wasn't sure if the person could see me or not. They could have been staring right at me, and I wouldn't even have known. This carried on for 5 minutes, until the crunching of leaves and snapping of twigs started again. It got fainter and fainter as they now moved away from me. I remained lying down for another solid 5 to 10 minutes, contemplating the best way to escape. Like an idiot, I'd ran off the path, and I wasn't sure where I was now or what the way back home was even. I didn't really care though. I was going to walk in one single direction until I left the woods and get home from there. I knew as soon as I started moving again, if this person was still there, they would hear me instantly. Should I try to run or try and sneak out? I opted for the latter. I slowly rose to my feet, listening constantly to my surroundings. I picked a direction and started walking. It wasn't perfectly quiet, but it was quiet enough to be sure I wouldn't be heard from too far away. I kept hearing snapping sounds and rustling in the distance around me. Every single time I would freeze. I'd hold my breath until I was happy no one was there, and then start walking again. I repeated this pattern for what felt like an eternity, until eventually I found the correct path. I screamed for joy in my mind and sped up my pace. After another 10 minutes, I saw it. The light. Streetlights flittering in through the trees. I'd never been so happy before to see a meager street lamp, but as I progressed to the end of the woods, my heart started to sink. I could see at the very end of the path was a black silhouette. Unmoving, contrasted against the light background, was the dark figure of a man standing there and waiting. What should I do now? Maybe it's a different person, perhaps someone walking their dog or something. I froze and watched them silently from the darkness, but they didn't move a single inch. They stood there, like they were guarding the entrance to the woods, or perhaps waiting for me. I didn't know what to do. By this point, though, I'd had enough. I was so close to getting out of there. I decided to bolt straight towards the exit, right towards them. I was a 6-foot young man. If they wanted to stop me at a full sprint, they'd have a hard job of it, I thought. That's what I did. I started sprinting. The figure grew and grew as I approached them, and I stepped out to the side. I heard someone growl loudly and felt something clip the back of my head and tug on the back of my jacket. I cleared the sheep gate, though, in one leap and sprinted into the light, breaking free from their grasp. I eventually stopped running when I could see the first house and looked back. The entrance to the woods was quite far away now, and I couldn't see anyone standing there anymore. Relaxing a bit more now, I finished my walk home. And that's pretty much it. I know it could have been me overreacting. Maybe it was someone out for a walk in the woods, a dog walker or a camper. I thought it was strange, though, that they didn't use their torch ever in that darkness, except briefly on that one occasion. Once they heard me as well, they seemed to actively seek me out. Who knows what would have happened if they would have caught me. In any case, I never walked that way home alone again, and definitely never at night. So this literally happened 30 minutes ago. I'm driving to work and it's about 3:30 a.m. or so. I take 3 different routes to work, but I've been taking the same one for a while now, since there's construction on every other route. I'm driving down this road, and on either side of it there were many subdivisions. I was listening to a podcast, trying my best to keep myself awake until I could grab some coffee. I started to get this uneasy feeling in my stomach. I thought it was my body telling me to get some caffeine and maybe something to eat. I tried my best to ignore it and continued driving. All of a sudden, though, this guy just runs out into the middle of the road. I could barely even see him, since he was wearing on all dark clothes. Thankfully, I managed to slow down in time, and I noticed he looked pretty freaked out. Now, I listen to a lot of creepy podcasts ranging from true crime to supernatural. I know the rules to stay safe in unexpected situations. I wish I listened to them today. Normally, I wouldn't stop for something like this, but I knew that if something happened to me, I would want someone to stop and help. So, that's what I tried to do. I kept my car running just in case, and rolled down the window just a little bit so I could talk to this guy and figure out what was wrong. I called out to ask if he was okay. He immediately started freaking out. He told me someone was trying to kill him. They had killed his dog and ripped it apart on his front lawn. He tried to grab the remains and run away and bury it, but he saw the man running after him with a knife. He said he thought it was probably a coyote or something at first, so he hadn't been suspicious, but he had run off when he saw the man coming at him. Now I was pretty freaked out too, but in my mind I noticed something. Yeah, it was dark out, but with the lights on inside my car and the lights that were on out front of the subdivisions, I could still see fairly well. He was younger, about his mid-30s, dark black hair and green eyes. He was wearing a hunter's jacket and jeans. What I noticed, however, that didn't match his story was that there was no blood or fur anywhere on him. I asked if his dog had been torn up so badly, why wasn't there any blood on him? Immediately his demeanor changed. It was like turning off a switch or something. My blood went cold. He just stared at me. What came out of his mouth next was the final straw for me. He started shaking severely and convulsing. Then his whole body relaxed at the same time. He stopped shaking, and he leaned in close towards my window and smiled at me. It was that twisted type of smile, and his eyes were dark. "I was going to help you, you know." He started cackling and trying to rip open my car door. Immediately I rolled up the window, put my car into drive, and sped off down the road, not stopping for anything. Once I finally got to work, I started crying. I still had 10 minutes before I had to go in, and honestly, I was terrified to even get out of my car.